Hello, my name is Charles Lincoln, and I'll be doing a presentation in regards to Nostrland Terratonia, this fictional scenario regarding international tax policy for developed countries. Again, my name is Charles Edward Andrew Lincoln IV. This is for the developed countries module, developed countries OECD module at the University of Amsterdam. So first of all, we need to talk about our countries in specifically Nostrland. The question is whether it's a capital import or capital export neutral country. It is an OECD country. It's based off the Netherlands, but it's not supposed to be directly the Netherlands. It's just sort of a point of reference. It's just a fictional scenario. Capital import neutrality would imply that the exemption method would be used, and capital export neutrality would imply that the credit method would be used. But it's kind of confusing which was which for Nostrland, and including the Netherlands as well. It's a large country with a large seaboard, so not exactly the Netherlands, but it has important international ports, similar to Rotterdam and even Amsterdam. It's heavily industrialized and highly educated, imposes very few legal restrictions on investment from the outside of countries, very much like many OECD countries, and unlike many developing countries. A substantial portion of the gross domestic product depends on cross-border trade and provisional services abroad. They have a significant maritime sector in regards to dredging, water management, harbor construction, harbor management, and seismological research, tugboats, firefighting. This is a photo from the Rotterdam Canal, Rotterdam shipping harbor. We have here an example of the offshore-onshore maritime sector. Now, as you can see, there's a large portion of oil exploration being carried out in the North Sea, which is on the continental shelf off the maritime sectors of Nostrland. And that's interesting because it takes a relatively short period of time. It's 1 to 2 weeks nature of work. So we could develop some sort of scenario where permanent establishments are developing in such a way that well. So permanent establishments, the lower threshold, but if they could then the other treaties will have to change, and may have to change. Possible changes to the PE. So we have relatively short working period times. You know, 1 to 2 weeks is the nature of the work, conditions at sea, amount of times paid. It's highly technical. It's an OECD country, and it follows the OECD models, especially in terms of business profits and permanent establishments. You could even reduce if the threshold is changed. So it follows the OECD, has 20% net profit as an exception to general 20%. It provides double tax relief through the exemption method. The permanent establishment, Nostraland has always been reluctant to accept the low PE threshold, often requested by by other countries, i.e., the low countries, because of activity that Nostraland carries out abroad. The resource levy is an addition to the corporate tax. This is different from the royalties that are owned by individuals in common law countries. They receive some further revenue from the business in the natural resource sector. The scope is the profit derived from the activities. The quantity of gross product is the gross withholding tax. The territorial reach is the tax jurisdiction of the waters, the continental shelf. That's also an issue as well. The tax policy network is extensive, and it also includes non-OECD countries. Now, the other country that has requested a renegotiation of the tax treaty is Taxation. Many subcontractors working on the continental shelf will be based in Taxation. And the OECD approach is 30 days for activities on the continental shelf. The territorial reach is undecided yet, but it could be negotiated. The corporate profit tax is 27%. So the corporate profit tax on net profits is 27%. Now here we have an interesting jurisdictional issue between Taxation, which in this case is the UK, and the Nostraland, the Netherlands. See, what we have is we have a possible nearness, and this nearness is in regards to the Sapporo case, which stated if the Nostraland and Taxation have a similar arrangement, that the free movement of workers does not preclude legislation of a member state granting incoming workers who prior to that employment in the member state resided in another member state at a distance of more than 150 kilometers from its border a flat rate exemption of reimbursement of extraterritorial expenses, while not granting such an exemption to an incoming worker resided less than that distance of the border, unless the exemption systematically gives rise to a net overcompensation in respect of the extraterritorial expenses actually incurred. So that's the situation, and something I might need to take into account. But Abertoni, Australia, in this situation, is an industrial country with population. Important natural resource sector onshore. Activities in both companies are the double tax relief, the corporate profit tax. Now, the issues that we need to look into is the policy, legislative changes, and new treaty policies. So Taxation will invest in Nostraland. Nostraland will invest in Taxation. This means that the Nostrian investor invests abroad. The Nostrian investor needs to give an exemption. The Nostrian tax administration needs to give an exemption for the investor abroad. Generally, in the past, Nostraland did not want to give lower permanent establishment thresholds because if we do this, then developing countries will want to give it all. Is there a way to have a compromise? And that's what I'm going to explore right now. Now, the implications for Taxation: residents of Taxation working in Nostraland will be confronted with PE issue, an additional resource and levies, but the continental shelf, and it has a credit system. Oh boy. It has Abertoni solved the lower threshold issue. It has a 12-month threshold issue, but it applies exploration and equipment. So it's a different type of threshold, the substantial equipment tests, and it provides a credit exemption. So there are possible solutions. You get the investors, both subcontractors, to invest. Both foreign countries that expects the investors to be in the shelf, so there will be taxable revenue on both sides. This could be formulated by requesting government ventures, two-tiered investors and subcontractors. Now, the UN Committee of Expert Reports on Taxation of Extractive Industries has stated that designing appropriate tax regimes in resource-rich countries is far from easy. The tax and broader fiscal system that applies to the extractive industry should ensure that government attains an adequate and appropriate share of the benefits from its resource taking into account that they are assets owned by the country and once extracted they are gone, while providing in return commensurate with the risks borne the function. Yeah, okay. Well, we need to put that in here because I mean the issue is the restrict. Okay. All right, so there is some policy behind this because you're taking into account that once the assets are owned by the country and once extracted, they are gone, while providing for returns commensurate with the risk borne and carried out by parties involved in this, and thus sufficient to attract the investment and capital desired. Now, the UN Committee of Experts in Report on Taxation of Extracted Industries has continued on stating that, in particular, that taxes are covered by a treaty when activities of investors, contractors, or subsidiaries are taxable. How the legislation may vary through the life cycles, and that's what's important, is having a uniform system of taxation. So not necessarily a uniform system of taxation, but a system of taxation that complements the other system of taxation. And the royalties used in the tax treaties need to be key that we separate those terms from what they mean in common parlance in common law countries. Whether the taxes or other levy is credible in the resident state or the investor, aspects of non-discrimination, and the territorial scope of the treaties. So the UN overview on extractive industries taxation has stated that extractive industries are an important sector and thus are potentially important revenue base for many developing countries and emerging economies. Given projections that by 2040, world population will increase by 2 billion persons, per capita will double. So we have some significant issues. Again, it's important to have the extractive industry structures, life cycles solid down because we need to have a uniform and complement, or not necessarily uniform, but a uniformly complementary system of extractive industries complementing each other. Now, the UN overview is basically you have to have stability, political, financial, monetary, legal obligations, labor market, and fiscal stability. On the macroeconomic backdrop, employing citizens, furthering the government's domestic and foreign policies, generating long-term revenue, and paying for government programs, supplying its inexpensive domestic energy. Now, the tax and broader fiscal systems that applies to the extractive industry should ensure that the government obtains an adequate and appropriate share of the benefits from its resources, taking into account that extractives are assets owned by the country. Once extracted, they are gone, while providing a return commensurate with the risk borne and functions carried out by the parties. Tax laws and regulations that provide legal certainty and stability reduce financial risk. So, the uniqueness of extractive industries. The sector is shaped by high sunk costs in the form of substantial investment that cannot be recouped if a project is unsuccessful. So that is key. That's vital. That's very unique in terms of the system. Long lead times from initial investment to product. It's very long. It's complicated. So there's lots of stuff. Fluctuating costs, commodity prices, turn and influence the profitability of exploration, development, and extraction. Violate demand and environmental impacts, including ultimately decommissioning or reclamation responsibilities. The extractive industries are often looked at in remote areas at a great distance from their eventual markets. At the same time, companies active in the extractive industries have potential substantial earnings, excess return on investments, i.e. windfall gains. So reducing the risks can be done through a joint venture that investors often seek to reduce risk by engaging in diversification, often in cooperation with other partners. This specifically can be conducted with government approval and licenses, especially in non-common law countries where, and common law countries, extractive industries can conduct their operations in such a way that government licensures are not required, as long as the extractive industries are conducted with in compliance with governmental regulations. Now, in civil law countries and other types of illegal jurisdictions, we have the system of taxation for the oil and gas industry that is based on extractive licensures that the civil law country provides to the licensing company, as long as that company meets specific regulations. Now, these regulations often can include the ability to change and reinterpret the potential of transferring these licenses to other investors. For example, if Chevron just for instance, if Chevron procured a licensing agreement to extract oil and gas out of the North Sea, Chevron could have the possibility, depending on if it received the contract with a transferable title, received the license with transferable title, it could give that contract to Exxon, and concurrently Exxon could transfer that license. In addition, it's also important to note that when these licenses are given, the license provides a certain type of common law term royalty where the income made through the distribution process can be given to another person in must be given to the government. So revenue contributed through the transferable contract licenses has to be contributed in part 1/8 royalty, as we would say in common law countries, to the government. So when you procure a license, it's the same as procuring a license from a private property owner in Texas and giving them 1/8 royalty. And these contracts are have been interpreted for about 100 years, and it's very important that when reducing the risk through joint ventures, that these contracts are clear. The oil and gas industry is characterized by joint ventures involving operators along with several other investing partners that own undivided interests. So they have an undivided interest in the project and participate in decisions pursuant to operating agreement. This approach is and has traditionally been the most common way of sharing economic risks. So the joint venture partners can also include government bodies such as non-governmental operators. So the less government ventures in the mining. So there's a dichotomy between the oil and gas industry and the mineral industry. The mining industry typically does not have the level of unincorporated joint ventures that oil and gas does. It is being more common for one investor to be involved in any particular project. There's less direct government participation in the mining projects as compared with the oil and gas sector. And the mining sector does not have the national mining companies comparable to the non-operating royalty interests. But like the oil and gas industry, the use of subcontractors is prevalent through many phases of the life cycle of a mine. So while keeping all these in thought, it's important to recognize how the differences of these various allocations of treatment can occur. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation. To him I give, heaven lifted me.